Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit. Accept no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world tonight. We're going to discuss transhumanism and the alchemical agenda. Now, this is the big conspiracy that underlies everything in this world. It's called transhumanism. If you don't know that by now, well, you're going to learn about it a little bit tonight. And this is a very old ideology. Make no mistake about it, even though it has a modern interpretation and twist assigned to it. Transhumanism has its roots in some very old occult sciences, and this is the thing that underlies everything going on in the world today. And tonight we're going to be reading from a book titled Transhumanism, a Grimoire of Alchemical Agendas by Dr. Joseph P. Farrell and Dr. Scott D. Hart. Now, I have a lot of admiration for Dr. Farrell. He has written a great many books on a great many subjects, and he is very thoroughly researched, and he has arrived at many of the same conclusions I have in my own independent studies. And, in fact, he's been able to flesh things out a little more for me, and this book is a fantastic read. I just recently was able to get my hands on this one. I had known of its existence for a while, but hadn't read it. And now I've begun reading it, and it really makes the picture so much more clear for myself. Now, of course, Dr. Farrell and Dr. DeHart here have different terminology that they have improvised into this to make it a little more palatable, to describe certain things, and I find that to be very useful. I find myself oftentimes creating my own words to describe certain aspects of this agenda, because the words we have in the English language are, well, they're not exactly good enough to truly describe or articulate the depth of meaning to all of it. So that's one thing that I like about this, is they took the time to come up with their own terminology so that we have a base understanding of a concept. And oftentimes, the concept itself transcends the limited use of vocabulary to describe. So they've done their best, much like I do my best, to try to describe certain things that seem to lack a specific type of description that can be phrased properly in words. It's a challenge for anybody who's looking at all of this alchemical symbolism. Oftentimes, these things are very hard to interpret using words or mere language. That's why the symbol itself is such an important thing. the symbol could encompass a whole broad range of different meanings, and that can't be as limited as what we would be with trying to describe it with mere language. So that being the case, that's what we're looking at, and we're going to explore a little bit into this work tonight to see what we can garner from this and lay down some key terms for people so that we can understand what's being manipulated in our society today. What is the whole crux of the social engineering campaign going on now? And of course, what are the ultimate end goals that these people who steer things in this world have in mind? And of course, it all culminates in what's known as transhumanism, or the post-human era, wherein mankind ostensibly will elevate to the next level of human evolution and become godlike. This transcendence that's been promised through time and history by those in the secret schools who would refer to this in the old times as apotheosis, the elevation of man to godhood. And of course, the idea has been twisted and contorted and perverted and inverted into what we have today, which is strictly the physical material world manifestation interpretation of all of these things. And that's what transhumanism is all about. And you'll see how there was a slow roll through the course of history to bring in this ideology in a technological type phase here, so that people in modern society can accept these things a little bit more readily. And of course, we're talking about certain ideological instances have come about at certain time frames here in our recent history that have inculcated these ideas, the prerequisites of these ideas, into man's mind. One of these key tenets involved with this is what we know as Darwinian evolution. Well, this is taking the old alchemical notion of evolution, which was a spiritual concept initially, and it was totally transformed and inverted into nothing more than a mere physical material world concept. And that is what they've done, and in so doing, they're trying to steer the human mind into nothing more than physicality or materiality here in this world, ignoring spiritual concerns or the spiritual components of things, and leaving that behind in order to instantiate some new type of thing here in this world. And I'll remind you folks, the Bible informs us there's nothing new under the sun, but they would most certainly like you to believe that this is something new. All of this has been tried before and done before and has failed before, and we've seen the results because, as Doctors Hart and Farrell here point out in the very first section of their book, this always seems to culminate in what we can call a Tower of Babel moment. And they talk about this. You may have heard me mention a Tower of Babel moment in past episodes I've done here, because most certainly it seems to be the case here, where if you violate natural laws, these natural laws that God the Creator put in place in this creation in which we live, these immutable natural laws, if you violate them for long enough, eventually you're going to have a catastrophic collapse of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish through the inversion principle of natural order. And that's largely what's being done in the name of this transhumanist movement today. Now, this transhumanist movement that's going on today is mostly quiet and going on in the background, and most people are blissfully unaware of any such thing. But it's time to wake people from their complacency about this and let them know in no uncertain terms, this is not science fiction. This is not just fanciful fiction or entertainment. You see, we've been handed these things through entertainment media, but certainly there's more to it than entertainment. It's all about capturing the human mind in a certain direction. And these are the things they're hoping to achieve through that. But without further ado, let's get directly into the reading because there's a lot of ground here to cover. And Dr. Farrell and Dr. Hart do a very, very good job of covering some of the basic precepts involved in what the modern interpretation of transhumanism is, not only by the transhumanists themselves, but by outside interpretation thereof, applying the lens of philosophy to this. So let's get directly into it. So part 1 of the book is called Towers and Topology. Interesting terms that they use here, towers and topology. The Tower of Babel moment, the fall of man, and the revelation of an agenda. And they start out here with a quote from Iamblichus, the famous Neoplatonist, from his work, The Theology of Arithmetic, which was translated into English by Robin Waterfield in 1988. And it says, quote, "Everything has been organized by the monad because it contains everything potentially, for even if they are not yet actual, nevertheless the monad holds seminally the principles which are within all numbers," end quote. The monad would be the universal one, folks, in the old Greek philosophy. And of course this has everything to do with sacred geometry and everything that goes along with that as well. And certainly we can see manifestations of various principles tied into the old philosophy here. So now we go to the introduction, the disconcerting images and agendas of alchemy. And then Dr. Farrell and Dr. Hart here give you a sentence that is spoken from the initiation of the fellow craft. That's the 2nd degree of Freemasonry. And it says, quote, "You are now in this degree permitted to extend your researches into the more hidden paths of nature and science," end quote. That's right, folks. The Masons, as well as the other secret orders, take these initiation rites and rituals on themselves, and they are often given these sentences, these statements, by whoever it is that's helping to perform the initiation process for them. And they are told these things, and many don't really understand what's being conveyed to them, especially in the mere 2nd degree of Freemasonry, the fellow craft. They don't really know they're talking about occult science. They don't know that's what's being conveyed there. They're just told that it's all ritual, it's all for fun, it's all just tradition that they do this. And most don't understand what they've gotten involved with. But let's read into the book here. "If we were to tell you that there is an alchemical agenda that transcends religions, secret societies, and spans the millennia, you would probably, and rightly, at least entertain the suspicion that we had taken momentary leave of our sanity. If we were to tell you further that this alchemical agenda spans virtually every discipline that you can think of, from biology to history, physics, topology, art, music, even, as we shall see in the main text, literary criticism, you would probably entertain that idea more seriously, for that, indeed, is what we are going to tell you in these pages, for superintending all the alchemical images and their implied agendas that we survey here, there is one standing out above them all, that both compels the agendas and simultaneously reveals some of them as forms of false alchemy. The image is that of primordial simplicity, or androgyny, or nothingness, or physical medium, or ether, or ocean of quantum flux, or grand architect of the universe. The image goes by many names depending on the fashion of the age and the particular agenda emphasized, but it is nonetheless the same image." And I'm going to pause before we proceed any further. I can't stress enough the importance of the image upon you folks. That's what this is all about. That's what it has always been about. It's about the image that mankind holds within his mind as to who he is, what his place in this universe is, who or what is God, who or what is this existence, who or what are we. This is the importance of the image. And as Drs. Farrell and Hart point out here, it reveals some of these as forms of false alchemy, and that's by and large what has happened in this world. These are the people in control, these dark occultists who run things. They've proffered false alchemy to the people and to those within the various levels of the secret society groups, and these agendas are based upon this false alchemy, this synthetic alchemy. that does not align with natural world principles, does not align with the Creator's principles and laws that he put in place for this world in which we live, and goes counter to that. And they've placed these images in the forefront of all of human accomplishment and human thought in this era. That's what's being pointed out here, and it is truly profound. And like I said, it underlies everything going on in this world. And when you realize how much of what it is that we've been taught that is false, you begin to understand the depth of how far this goes. Once you realize that about 90 to 95% of everything you've ever learned in school and elsewhere is wrong, or misconstrued to you in some way, misinterpreted, misdescribed, then you begin to see a little more clearly. But it's a gradual process, and it's a time-consuming process, because you need to unlearn everything you thought you knew before you can learn about the truths, these philosophical truths, that undergird our reality in many ways. And this reaches way beyond religion, philosophy, science, everything. Every discipline that we have, everything in this world, it undergirds all of it. And that's the important point. There is this false alchemical agenda that permeates through all of it. And it's by design, and it's by social engineering, by these dark occultists who run things in this world that have their own personal agendas that they want to see fulfilled. And in their hubris, they think they can accomplish this through the use of technologies, advanced technologies. And they don't see a problem with what they're doing because they have misconstrued some of the old teachings and aligned them to their agendas. And that is how it's been promulgated into modern occultism today and the modern secret society groups and modern thought today. So they think they're correct, even though they've taken a total inversion principle into play against all of these natural forms of alchemy that have gone on for many, many years. This is largely what happens when you take secrecy into the mix, and that is what they've done. You had a select few people that learned a couple things that were valuable insights into how the world and nature operates, and they kept hidden this information from the masses. And through the course of time, and because of the nature of human psychology, these people sought only to further enrich themselves and their kin, those that they deem worthy, and have kept hidden away from mankind some of these secrets of the ages in the bonds of secrecy within some of these organizations that started out as the ancient mystery schools. And through the course of time, many of these teachings have been distorted, inverted, and perverted, and have turned now into what we receive today in the guise of modern occultism through the secret society groups and other places. And of course, the New Age movement is an offshoot of this, and all of the Gnosticism and everything else that's arisen is an offshoot of this perversion and inversion, this false alchemy as described here by Drs. Hart and Farrell in this book, and they are correct. It is false alchemy, and many have misconstrued it with the true nature of what alchemy is, or was at one point. And this is problematic, because what they've presented to us today as actual natural science, or alchemy, is the inversion principle thereof, and they've applied it towards dark agendas. And that's the whole premise here. So it's a false image we've been handed, and it's a false image that most people accept and work towards. A lie, the great lie, as proffered in the Garden of Eden. Let's continue reading here. This means that modern man is in a predicament, for he is about to be sacrificed either upon an apocalyptic altar of alchemical science, or If one is to believe the three great Yahwisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, slaughtered by a righteous God, come back to restore justice to the world by an unparalleled bloodletting prior to mankind's final transformation. If one is to believe a certain strand of Christian fundamentalist eschatology into the very same sorts of alchemical creations as proffered by the transhumanist science they excoriate. Either way, the transhumanist gospels of science, or the revelations, prophets, and ministers of Yahwism, are saying the same thing. The new age is here. Prepare to die as part of your process of alchemical transformation. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So certainly we can see the apocalyptic scriptures in the religious context fulfill many of these same types of ideas that the transhumanist notion does. It's just a matter of interpretation, and it's a matter of which side of the fence do you stand upon. But ultimately, it looks like the image has been crafted in man's mind that we are reaching the end of a cycle and a new awakening, a new age, a new era of mankind. This has been crafted into the zeitgeist, folks. The zeitgeist simply meaning the spirit of the time. For we all recognize something's wrong, and we think we are witnessing the birth pangs of a next era of sorts here. Is the apocalypse truly upon us? Hard to say for sure what the true nature of all of this symbology is in the religious context as well as within the philosophical context. And it's a matter of, what do we do with this information? What's been done with this information by these dark occultists who run things is another story altogether. They are trying to directly steer us into this transhumanist notion of pure physicality and manifestation here in the material realm, immortality in the material realm, and all the things that are associated with that. Apotheosis, the elevation of mankind to the next level, to becoming godlike. Of course, they see all of this happening strictly in the physical, material world here. That is wherein the distinction lies. They've disregarded spiritual concerns. They've disregarded all the spiritual worlds that coexist within, throughout, and around this realm in which we live. And they are seeking to just become the gods of this place, of this physical reality. And it's a false hope for them, folks. It's a lie. They can never do that. Man cannot control nature as much as he may try, and as much as he may succeed on certain fronts in controlling portions of it. He cannot control the natural laws that were instantiated by the Creator in this place. He cannot change them. They are immutable. Although he tries his best. Let's continue reading. So it says, "For those caught in the middle, neither worshipping the unrestrained power lust of modern science, nor the bloodthirsty God of the revealed monotheisms, this is indeed a predicament. In this book, we propose to examine the first pole of this sacrificial dialectic, the scientific one, reserving our comments on the bloody eschatology of the three great Yahwisms for a future work and sequel to this, though we shall, of course, treat it briefly here. Nonetheless, we are concerned here with altars and an alchemical transhumanist apocalypse, for in this case the altars are not only in churches, but the altar is preparation, is the earth. The altar in preparation is the earth. The sacrifice is mankind, and the alchemy is, well, alchemy, for there is nothing terribly modern about the goals and agendas being discussed and advanced in modern science at all. In the introduction to our previous book, The Grid of the Gods, we wrote, quote, "Modern science is but a technique of the imagination to bring into reality the operations of the magical intellect and the mythologies of the ancients with consistent and predictable regularity. This implies, therefore, that the magical intellect encountered so often in ancient texts, myths, and monuments is, in fact, the product of a decayed science. but a science nonetheless. Much of modern physics may be viewed as but hermetic metaphysics with topological equations, and by a similar process of examination, much of modern genetics may be viewed as but the myths of Sumer, Babylon, and even the Mayans, given flesh by the techniques of genetic engineering, end quote. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So these two doctors, Dr. Hart and Dr. Farrell, both noticed many of these same tropes that I have noticed, these connections between our modern science and some of the old hermetic principles and philosophies of antiquity, that they do have a distinct bond, that metaphysics and physics are one and the same, and one is just the physical paradigm of the other. Metaphysics relating to probably the more spiritual side of physics, and the physics itself, of course, being the material world physics. Two sides of the same coin. They are one and the same thing. It's just a matter of your perspective of it. So they understood this, and many of these old natural sciences and occult sciences, these alchemical sciences, are based on natural principles, and their opposition is based on the synthetic, the artificial version, the inversion of these things. And oftentimes, these people who push these agendas, these dark occultists who run things in this world, will use the metaphysical side of the equation to get things done, although they will staunchly deny the existence of the metaphysical side because it can't be easily quantified. And that's why they seek a grand unified theory of physics as well as other things, because if you have a grand unified theory of physics, you have a framework for control. And they can't control all of nature, as we had discussed here previous, although they try. And how do they do it? By quantifying it. If you can measure or count a thing, you can garner some type of control over it. That's what it's all about. This is the science of cybernetics, which is in direct opposition to the old alchemy. This is the inversion principle of alchemy, cybernetics. This is what it's all about. You see, many of the great mystics and philosophers of the past have understood how to work within the bounds of nature, work with nature, let the will of God be done here rather than the will of man. Now, these people in control, these staunch transhumanists, are all about control themselves. They want to be the ones that direct agendas and worldly advances and stuff here. They want to be the ones that direct and guide human evolution. And that can't be done by mankind. This is something that we're supposed to, in the spiritual, let go and let God, for lack of a better terminology here. Let go and let God. And this is what people of faith often have to do, and it's a lesson that we learn here in physicality. We need to let God do His thing. Sometimes we need to take a step back and let the Holy Spirit guide and direct things rather than trying to impose our will on the creation. And that's largely what these dark occultists who run things want to do. They want to impose their own will upon this creation and steer and direct it and build it themselves. They think they can do it better in their hubris. And this is what they seek to do. And we're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to let go and let God, for lack of better phraseology here. We're supposed to go in the direction that we're inclined to go by the Spirit, rather than to try to impose our will here physically and our own agendas that benefit only us and not others here physically. It's all about service and to others and love in the spiritual. And most, sadly to say here in this world, have lost that connection to spirit. These dark occultists who run things have been trying to engineer the spirit out of everything. Just a physical shell, an automaton, a homunculus, an empty vessel, a golem, That's what they seek to transform mankind into. If you go back and look at the old alchemical teachings, you find all of these concepts in antiquity. It's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. It's just described a little differently for our more modern sensibilities today. They apply the technology factor to it. Let's read on here and see what else we can garner from this writing. Though we both noticed this odd coincidence of modern science and ancient myths, each of us came to the writing of this book by very different and yet, in many respects, by very parallel routes. Indeed, for both of us, a heavy atmosphere of synchronicity hovers over the observations and experiences that brought us here to this book. For each of us, the process began when we were both at Oxford, though at different times, pursuing our PhDs in theology, and we each kept what we were noticing carefully to ourselves in hidden thoughts written in notebooks of observations, carefully held away from public view or hidden even more carefully away on the tablets of our minds. There, like Percy Shelley's tormented monster creator Victor Frankenstein, we began to notice things in the writings of medieval schoolmen, alchemists, theologians, and novelists. And we have a quote here, quote, "These thoughts supported my spirits while I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardor. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes, on the very brink of certainty, I failed, yet still I clung to the hope which the next day or the next hour might realize. One secret which I alone possessed was the hope to which I had dedicated myself, and the moon gazed on my midnight labors while with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil?" End quote. We, too, were after an answer regarding how the ancients understood nature, life, death, and the creation or recreation of life. And quite naturally so, for as students of theology and philosophy, our journey was to be a focus of our doctoral research, as well as lead us down paths that until now were shared only between the two of us in private conversations. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So, much like these two gentlemen, I have been taking careful note of things in my mind's eye about a lot of these same tropes that seem to undergird everything. They span the realms of philosophy, religion, science, sociology, everything you can think of. We have some of these seemingly unrelated things that all have these same underlying energies betwixt within them. And we're going to explore a little bit of that, because now Doctors Hart and Farrell give what they call here a description of definitions and preliminary observations, and they give three key terms at the top of this next portion here. The first one is alchemo-chimerical man, alchemo-vegetable man, alchemo-sexual man. Those are the three terms that they have defined. These are words they created to describe some of these concepts, which I also have recognized inherent in many of these different studies, in many of these different ways of thinking. So let's read on. So he says, "Why was it, we wondered, that the basic ancient myths, excepting those offshoots of Yahwism, were based on the idea of mankind's descent from a primordial androgyny, through the mineral, through the vegetable, and finally into the animal kingdoms? How could the ancient myths even speak of a mineral man or a vegetable man? These images are disconcerting, even nonsensical, but the most disconcerting thing about them, as we discovered, was that they also reappeared in the snapshots of modern science that every so often make a column filler article in a newspaper or make their way around internet sites." And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. I've pointed out some of these things in the past. They make their way into scientific, peer-reviewed studies as well. You find many of these same commonalities in all of that. It's an interesting thing to think about, how all of these old alchemical ways of thinking have permeated into our modern science and have found root even within the scientific paradigm, the accepted modern science, which is said to discredit all of those old things. But the more we learn, the less we seem to know, right? Let's read on. Why was it, we wondered, that ancient esoteric lore could speak of the lowest level of mankind's descent, that of the animal kingdom, populating its mythological world with chimerical hybrid creatures, half animal and half human, and modern science could speak of the same things, even calling them manimals, as a goal to be sought? Why was it, we wondered, that ascending from this to the vegetable kingdom, which paradoxically was viewed in the ancient lore as a higher kingdom than the animal, why was it that the ancient images could speak of strange androgynies, of fusions between the plant and human, and in modern times, why is it that genetically modified plants sprouting their own kind of alchemical seedless seeds, or plants modified with splices of human DNA, were touted once again as a goal to be sought, as a good thing that would be a boon to mankind? We wondered, was it possible that the whole agenda of modern science was, from top to bottom, an alchemical agenda for the complete transformation of mankind? Was this genetically modified food for the alchemically modified man? Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. And I think this is a very important question they are asking, and I think it's demonstrable that that is indeed what our modern science is all about. It's about transmuting man into this next phase of human evolution, the post-human era, or transhumanism. You see, it's all the same old things, same old philosophies, just with a new, more modern veneer put on it, and a technological aspect applied to it. The same concepts are ever present. Let's read on. Ascending from there to the mineral man, again we wondered, why were so many within the transhumanist movement seeming to speak, through all their modern verbal coinage, nothing but the language of ancient lore and alchemy? Once again, there seemed to be an agenda that was nothing less than a quest for an androgynous fusion of man and machine, of man and the mineral. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. And certainly, Drs. Hart and Farrell are spot on in their assessment here. This is absolutely what transhumanism truly is. Nothing new under the sun. It's this misuse or misapplication of the old alchemical principles in reverse order, the inversion principle applied, to bring about this change in mankind. They are trying to re-engineer all of humanity and all of the earth into something wholly artificial, something completely synthetic that does not belong in this natural world, that goes against natural law as put in place by the Creator. And it can't possibly last or stand the test of time, and it is doomed to fail catastrophically, as borne out in the histories given to us prior in a Tower of Babel moment. But yet these people, in their hubris, they think they can do it. They think they can get this done. They can accomplish this goal. They can become God. And it's a lie. It's the great lie proffered in the Garden of Eden, folks. Man cannot be God, no matter how hard he tries. Now, man may achieve great things and may be made in the image of God, as we are told, and as such we are little creators. We can work within the creation to make new things. But we still need to obey the natural laws put in place in this place by the Creator. We need to stay within the bounds of that, or there will be backlash. Make no mistake about that. There will be catastrophic results that abound. And that's why we are given these stories like that of the Tower of Babel. But let's continue reading and see what Drs. Hart and Farrell have to say about all of this. Continuing, it says, this brought us to a consideration of the most disconcerting image of them all, androgyny itself. which more often than not stood for a fusion of many sorts of paired principles that seemed at first unrelated to the concept of androgyny in its most basic sense. It stood, in other words, precisely for that fusion of the human and the animal, the human and the vegetable, of the human and the mineral, as it stood also for the fusion or union of the masculine and the feminine, the male and the female. And I'm going to pause again there, folks. This is the union of opposites. That's what androgyny as a symbol represents. This union of opposites, the alchemical wedding, the alchemical marriage of the feminine and masculine aspects, bringing together the opposite poles in union. It represents a lot of different things. Let's put it that way. It's a very broad symbol that could be interpreted a lot of different ways, and it has been misused and misapplied in the modern era to engineer not only this transgender push that we see, but also this transhumanist push that we are beginning to see in the public realm of things. You see, they're very subtle in how they operate, and they work in steps. It's a little concept called the Overton window. They gradually shift what the public accepts as normal by introducing more and more bizarre fringe ideas on the outskirts, and then shifting this window of observance of acceptance towards those things. So by presenting something as outlandish as man's going to merge with machines and become God, now we have that idea out there in the entertainment culture. Now, they've kind of normalized this notion that you can choose your gender. You could be whatever gender you want. There's more than two genders. There's how many ever different genders you want there to be. It's a spectrum of genders. Now they've kind of normalized this, or they're beginning to try to normalize this in society. And I think they're a generation or two away from completely normalizing that to that degree. But at any rate, we see the push, this social engineering campaign going on for that. And this is just one of the precursor elements towards transhumanism, because the next step will be you can be whatever you want. And I think we're beginning to see that. You have people out there that will identify as, I'm a cat. You've seen these stories before. I don't know how many of them are true or not, where different schools have to accept if a student identifies as a cat, they have to let them act like that, and they're not allowed to discipline them for acting in that way in those types of situations. We've seen the stories. Like I said, I don't know if they're true, but they're put out there on social media for a reason, to try to normalize these concepts. You see, it's the shifting of the Overton window. The more absurd the idea, the more acceptable the slightly less absurd idea becomes. That's how it all works. It's a tool. It's a gradual tool used to socially engineer the masses. And they're pushing us towards these things. And of course, this concept, this philosophical concept or symbol that is androgyny, represents some of that. So let's read on and see what else they tell us here. We realized that we needed a whole new vocabulary even to be able to discuss the alchemical connections and roots of all these things. Alchemical man, to designate the transformation of mankind into a chimerical creature via the techniques of science. Vegetable man, to discuss the fusions of man and plant, again via the techniques of science. Mineral man, to designate the alchemical fusion of man and machine, again by the techniques of applied science, for in each case science is functioning as nothing but an extension of alchemy, itself a technique, for the transformation of mankind, which is, of course, a primary goal of alchemy and its modern equivalent, transhumanism. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. And they are spot on. The only thing is, alchemy as presented to us today is this distorted false alchemy, as they pointed out earlier. And this is also known as the great work to those dark occultists who run things. The fulfillment of transhumanism is the great work to these people, folks. Make no doubt about it. It's all one and the same thing being talked about here. For us, the term transhumanism really serves only to mask what is a very old and explicitly alchemical apocalyptic agenda. In short, while the techniques of science may be more refined than those of the pseudoscience of alchemy, the goals remained essentially and existentially the same. That left the most disconcerting image of them all, one found in nearly every culture and religion, even the Jewish and the Christian, though it is very carefully disguised and the subject carefully avoided. That image was the image of the primordial androgyny, both of God and of man. Why was it, we wondered, that so many of the initiatory rites of secret societies and fraternal organizations within the Occidental tradition were overtly and yet subtly alchemosexual in nature? And patience, we will explain the strange term alchemosexual shortly. One need think only of the allegations of skull and bones initiates at Yale stripping naked and wrestling in mud, or as we shall see in the main text, of the androgynous implications of Masonic initiation rites. Why is it, moreover, that those societies so often restricted their memberships to men? The mystery deepened the more we looked. As Joseph delved into research and authored a whole series of books on ancient physics and history, again and again, and to his consternation, he bumped into what can only be described as a primordial masculine androgyny, oftentimes associated with alchemical doctrines, that is to say, a view of the gods, or of God, or even of the prime matter or soup, that was deeply, explicitly, and simultaneously masculine, androgynous, and alchemical, both in its symbolism and in its implications. Oftentimes, this imagery would appear the most explicit precisely in those religions and cultures most strongly condemning alchemy, alchemical or esoteric societies, and alchemosexual rituals or ceremonies. One need only consider the Christian Trinity as such an androgynous image, laden with multiple levels of meanings and potential misunderstandings, and how, by contrast, the Roman Church, for one, has left, more or less officially and almost universally, condemned any esoteric alchemical practices or fraternities, especially those in which life appears to imitate the art of the mysterious image. At the minimum, it seemed to us that there was a disconnect between the effeminate Jesus image of Roman Catholic religious iconography and the ethic. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So now Doctors Hart and Farrell are pointing out this connection, what they call the alchemosexual connection here, to this seemingly masculine androgynous figure, and they're relating it to these different icons in Roman Catholic imagery. So we have this same theme underlying many different religious principles, and of course the Trinity seems to be a universal thing across all different religious structures and philosophies. So we have this androgynous, primarily masculine binding principle that we are handed here. And it's an interesting thing to think about. Well, where does all this come from? Where does it lead? And what is the principle really all about? And of course, it comes back to this notion of unity, of oneness, being separated. This connection to God or to Source, the monad discussed by the Greek philosophers. Back to Source. And of course, this division of these things to create physical manifestation here. Then we have these polarized opposites that come into view, and out of necessity, because we don't have any other way of thinking in this physical world realm. And this is something that's hard to express in words. We only know what we know here, and we have limited perceptions of reality. We have limited intellect of what we could perceive as being actual or real, and we could scarcely imagine some of the other spiritual planes or realms out there. We just don't know what we don't know. We don't have the complete mind of God, of this oneness, of this universality. And we are human. We are limited in our perceptions. So it's hard for us to conceive of these things. And language is not adequate to express it. So oftentimes they rely on symbols to do so. And of course we see the undergirding symbolism of this masculine androgynous principle at the heart of all of it. And that's what they're pointing out here. So let's get back to this, and this does have some alchemical ties, as we'll see. So it says, however, other religions adopting a similar imagery followed the principle of life imitating art, and thus freely approved of or instituted corresponding rituals, ceremonies, and life practices consistent with the alchemosexual imagery related to God or the gods. How then did one account for the difference? And at what point did it arise? And why? This too was a mystery. Why did some promote such masculine images, then qualify them by theological caveats, stating that God was beyond or above such sexual distinctions, and was in fact a kind of androgyne in their own version of the masculine androgyny? Why then, at the same time, did some religions and cultures insist on the performance and revelatory character of this image, and therefore establish it as the final character of those masculine androgynous gods, the alchemosexual images themselves, and then go on to condemn the rituals, ceremonies, and corresponding practices which are implied in them? Why, in other words, did some accept it and others reject it when the symbolism to depict the divine was explicitly alchemosexual? Indeed, what led the ancients even to conceive of this oxymoronic idea of a masculine androgyny in the first place, and then to regard it as a kind of metaphysical, indeed even physical, first principle? Over several years of such discussion, we began to suspect that there was more going on here than met the eye, and began to explore the possibility that this image may have been a profound cosmological clue, perhaps even a residue of very old doctrines, a legacy coming from high antiquity, and that the image was therefore not original to the later classical and esoteric systems promoting it. We began to suspect that maybe the imagery had less to do with religion than with metaphors about the underlying physical substrate or materia prima itself, with the god behind the god, as it were. Then a second mystery was added to compound the first. As our study was theology, early Christian history, doctrine, and ritual, we were familiar with a little known, one is tempted to say deeply and deliberately buried, early tradition that mankind himself was originally created as a kind of masculine androgynous alchemosexual creature that was capable of some sort of reproduction. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. And this is exactly what things like the secret doctrine discuss. The secret doctrine of theosophy, the secret doctrine underlying Rosicrucianism, all these secret society groups, they talk about this. We've discussed this on this show on past episodes. That they say man at one time was dual-sexed and was able to reproduce unto himself. Didn't need a sexual partner. And that perhaps this is one of the ideas that underlies this, according to Drs. Hart and Farrell here. So let's read on. As will be seen in the main body of this book, variations of this tradition held that the division of the sexes was a result of the fall of man, or accomplished in prevision for it. The implication of such a view, again, was disturbing to say the least, for implicit in that idea is the notion that any reproduction by the original masculine androgynous man would by the nature of the case have been homosexual or asexual in nature. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So according to the secret doctrine, when man was this dual-sexed being, he kind of sprouted a bud off of himself that would become a new human being. This is what's said, so that's more of a form of asexual reproduction associated more closely with plants. And you see how this whole vegetable man idea that the doctors here were talking about comes into play as well. Do you see the distinctions and how it all interrelates? And how these ideas permeate through all these philosophical and religious ideals, and of course modern scientific ways of thinking too. It's interesting. Let's read on. As we dug, we soon realized that this concept also had a far older provenance than just the Christian, or for that matter, just the Jewish traditions. It was also a traditional teaching of the deepest and oldest mystery schools, and was a principal component of very old esoteric and occult doctrines, from Egypt to China to Mesoamerica. The clear impression that these gave was, once again, that the idea came from remotest antiquity. Thus, the mystery deepened. When and why was this tradition obfuscated? And when and why did persecution of any manifestation of alchemosexuality, metaphorical or otherwise, emerge? Coupled with this problem was another, the emergence of bloody and oftentimes human sacrifice. As we continued to research down the long avenues of esoteric tradition and ancient Hermetic texts, we encountered yet other clues indissolubly connected at every turn to this very ancient image of the primordial masculine alchemosexuality, and indeed, we have eventually come to view these clues as the three most closely held secrets at the core of such fraternities, secret societies, and mystery schools dating back into the mists of high antiquity. The first of these secrets was, as already mentioned, that in these ancient cosmological systems, the primordial symbol both of God and of man is alchemosexual in nature, not as a matter of faith or revelation, but as a matter of a kind of formally explicit knowledge about the physics of the medium itself. However, coupled always to this in the ancient view were, curiously, two other secrets or mysteries, and they're namely as such. The first one. Now remember, these are said to be some of the secrets of these mystery schools of antiquity that have been brought forward through the course of time. The first one, that God, or at least someone or something, or depending upon the particular interpretation in view, nothing exists, not as a matter of faith, but as a matter of a kind of formally explicit knowledge. And secondly, that personal immortality also exists, not as a matter of faith, but again as a kind of formally explicit knowledge. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So this formally explicit knowledge has been handed down from time immemorial. We don't know the source where this comes from. But we are told these things, and we seem to accept these things as universal truths. We have this view that there is God, that he does exist, and I think that's demonstrable. Or some would take the opposing point of view, and this is wherein we have this false alchemy being foisted into the public consciousness here. Nothing or nothingness exists. That is what their version of God, the Creator, is. Nothing. The great nothingness. And if you go and you look at some of the old teachings that you'll find online regarding things like what the Illuminati believe and what various of these other secret societies believe, they believe in this whole nothingness concept at the top of all of it. And that is why they are devoid, many times, of spiritual morality. And this is the false dichotomy. But also, they say here that personal immortality also exists as a form of formally explicit knowledge. We don't know where this comes from either. But they're trying to engineer that idea out of humankind. They don't want you to think that you continue on beyond this physical realm. They want you to think that death in this physical realm, that's it. And that any experiences, maybe people have reported of near-death experiences and things like this, it's nothing more than the byproduct of the electrochemical activity of the brain and brainstem. That's what they firmly want you to believe with their modern science. And that after such time, that's it. You're done. That you're nothing more than these physical components. Nothing could be further from the truth. But certainly, we have this explicit, formal knowledge from antiquity that we do continue on. And we need to act as such. We need to be concerned with the spiritual portions of things. But you see, the proponents of transhumanism are trying to engineer that out of mankind. And they're trying to engineer the idea of nothingness in the place of God. So you see, they're using the inversion principle. Instead of life, eternal life, they're handing you death. Death-based ideas, death-based culture. Instead of God, They hand you nothing. They give you the Big Bang Theory and various other things. Everything just happened by accident, and here we are, spiraling out of control in this vast, almost infinite universe that we know next to nothing about, flying in 3 different directions at once through the void of space. You're nothing but a speck of dust. You see the idea? They've tried to engineer God and the immortal soul or spirit out of mankind. This is the inversion principle being applied, and this is the ultimate goal of transhumanism, to bind you into thinking in this physical world way. And of course, their goal is to become immortal in the physical world here and continue on, but it is a false dichotomy. It's a false hope. Can't possibly be done. Although in their hubris they think they can do it. And they will try. And they will fail catastrophically when another Tower of Babel moment happens, even if they do succeed for some time. But let's continue reading here. We were not, we tentatively concluded, looking at anything theological or metaphysical in the conventional senses of the terms, nor were we looking at anything merely sexual, but rather at something that encompassed sexual, spiritual, and metaphysical, and even biology and physics components into one confusing, if not disconcerting, whole. With respect to the first of these 3 secrets, the curious and ambiguous wording is necessary due to the extraordinary nature of the statements made in those ancient texts and cosmologies. One was dealing with systems that defied conventional analysis or pigeonholing into a theistic or atheistic box, but rather, as will be seen in the main text, with systems that could fit into both at the same time. The images and cosmologies in view were, in other words, a kind of acid drip on all conventional techniques of dialectical philosophical analysis. They were components of a deep cosmic and anthropological ritual. They defied convention and tradition precisely because they claimed to be the oldest conventions and traditions. All others were reductions to one particular subset of implications. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So there's some deep and profound ideas that are at the core of all of this, and they've been leveraged by the transhumanist factions in this world to try to deify modern science as the new god of this age, and to elevate man to his position in the post-human era. And what they're engineering is based upon these principles that don't really have adequate language to describe them. So Doctors Farrell and Hart here came up with their own terminology, and we've discussed some of that, and now they're going to be talking in this portion about what they call alchemosexuality as a metaphysical first principle. And this is an important idea to keep in mind. And this is the term they've applied to it, because you have to invent words to talk about these things sometimes. Because of the nature of the symbology involved, it oftentimes transcends the limitations of language. So sometimes you need to invent a term to describe something, much like I like to describe what I call synchromystic metadata. This information field that we all seem to access here with our subconscious and unconscious minds. What they might call the Akashic record, what they might call genetic memory, epigenetic memory, the quantum information field, whatever you want to call it. The zeitgeist, I think, is a good term for it. The spirit of the time, because there is a spiritual component of this as well. So, whatever you want to call it, it's there. And I think we can agree upon that. It's this information field wherein you can access certain things through intuition and through various other means and understand. It's a gut feeling sometimes. It's an intuition you have. It's an instinct. The information's in the field, and you pick up on it. Things like the 100th monkey effect operate on this same principle. And I like the term zeitgeist to describe this, but what they're calling here as a metaphysical first principle, alchemosexuality, is something different, and I don't want to get hung up on that, but what my whole point is, sometimes you have to invent your own terminology to describe these things adequately, and that's what they've done here, and I have a lot of respect for these gentlemen for so doing. So let's read on. So it says, for us, the question then became, why should all three of these things be so persistently, consistently, and alchemically linked, from the Vedas of India, the I Ching of China, to the Netters of Egypt, and even to the Popol Vuh of the Maya in Mesoamerica, and the emanations of the Hermetica, of Plato, and of the Neoplatonists? The widespread diffusion of the alchemosexual symbolism of God or man defied any conventional diffusionist model. It was an argument that one had, perforce, to be looking at a symbolic legacy coming down from high antiquity, or at the minimum at a kind of Jungian archetype in the human mind itself, or both. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. The Jungian archetype. That's a term I like to use, archetype, because it's a template that the unconscious human mind recognizes inherently, because it's part of this information field. It recognizes it, doesn't necessarily make the association on a conscious level, but the unconscious mind certainly recognizes it and causes a type of reaction in the subconscious that will later translate as conscious behavior changes. And they've leveraged these things through the course of time, these social engineers and dark occultists who've run things in this world. They like to use these principles to affect man's images in his mind of the world and of these things. And this relates to that kind of a concept. Let's read on. As we researched further, more questions surfaced. Why, for example, was there an emergence of this imagery in the poetry and prose of the otherwise reserved and staid English Victorian era? Repeatedly throughout the 19th century English literature, one encounters images so disturbing to normal sensibilities that the authors were condemned for their work. Two of the 19th century men of letters we will consider, though the list of such authors could be far larger and require a book unto itself, wrote Gothic novels with alchemy, apocalyptic revolutionary visions, and forbidden love as a lurking shadow behind the main characters, namely Percy Shelley and Oscar Wilde. Most biographers have accurately noted that both with Shelley and Wilde, their personal lives and the art which was inspired by it was anything but normal by the standards of their day. Even today, some would find Shelley and Wilde's philosophy of love far beyond the acceptable norm, and it is precisely at this point that our research attempts to indicate correlations between alchemy and an ideal for the higher man, a godlike man. Unlike the state and the church, we are neither condemning certain literature as immoral, nor are we passing judgment on the lifestyle of the authors of such controversial literature. We do seek, however, to understand why they were moved to write novels with alchemical agendas and imagery which would unnerve the fragile conscience of their readers. Was the life or even the love that was sought by their protagonists or even antagonists, not to mention the authors themselves, higher, or was it dangerously subversive to the future of mankind? In our search for an answer to that question, we discovered that even within the Christian patriotic and Gnostic traditions, there were clear allusions to the same idea. Allusions taken over almost whole cloth from very ancient and very non-Christian sources. Again, we encountered the imagery from the Mayans to the ancient Vedic Indians. The question for us, then, is why is this there, and how might one rationalize it? Here, the key, oddly enough, lies in ancient cosmologies, in the physics and a profound topological metaphor that we have explored in previous books. The presence of this metaphor is in itself perplexing, for it cannot be gainsaid that it is not only both ancient and fairly universal, having every appearance of having come from high antiquity, but also that the metaphor itself stresses the fact that this, quote, primordial alchemosexual androgyny, end quote, is primordial, i.e., it is regarded as a kind of metaphysical first principle by almost all who employed it. And again, the question is, Why is it there in the first place? In this book, we attempt to argue a speculative answer to those questions. And I'm going to pause for a moment there, folks. And I don't think we're going to get that far tonight. Certainly not. This is a rather large book, and I do highly recommend pick it up and give it a read if you can. And I think I am going to do some future programs from this book, because much of what these two gentlemen found align with the same ideals that I found on this. And they give some pretty good speculative answers to things. And we can use this as a resource to understand things going on in the world today. But here we're going to finish out this last portion before we close up today. This section is called The Term Alchemosexuality and the Constellation of Concepts Embraced in It. But this fact, to our mind, was perplexing for a very different reason, for it was clear to us that we needed to coin a whole new vocabulary to talk about it, without falling into the trap of advocating any sort of position toward it. Again, our need was to rationalize the thought process, not justify it. We were not alone in feeling this need, for as will be seen in the main text, the 19th century Uranian scholars felt the same need too. For us, however, the need arises not merely from the need to avoid contemporary terms, which perforce concentrates attention only and merely upon a physical or sexual phenomenon, and thus avoids the spiritual, aesthetic, and social implications implied by the primordial metaphor in all its fullness, but it also arises out of the fact that the metaphor finds expression in the esoteric tradition and even in secret societies. Going to pause for a moment, and that's where the rubber meets the road. A lot of these ideas are put forward through the secret societies, but they apply the inversion principle and the misinterpretation thereof, and we have a convoluted mess in society because of it. You see, the secret society groups, their whole premise or basis of esoterica is only in the guise of intellectualism. They don't apply the spiritual to it. They don't apply the heart to it, the heart and soul, the actual living portion of it. It's just the intellectual concept. That's what they are always obsessed with, because they believe that man's intellect will allow him to achieve this great work, this transhumanist immortality and ascension to becoming the next phase in human evolution, to become godlike, the apotheosis, post-humanism. That's what they believe and what they push. Pure logic and reason without taking the emotional or spiritual aspects of things into account. The television show Star Trek. Did you think that Mr. Spock was put there by accident, or this was just some trope of science fiction where the Vulcans were unemotional, that they were strictly logical all the time? Well, this is a precept of the philosophers of fire. They think their intellect will save them. This is the Luciferian philosophy at its core. Their intellect, that through man's intellect he will become godlike. And that if he could just dissociate himself from what they call the lower animal versions in his being, the emotions, folks, the instincts, the intuitions, if he could isolate and separate that from himself and become purely a thinking machine, then he can ascend. When he doesn't have these emotional concerns, this violates the moral, absolute, immutable natural laws that God the Creator put in this place. There's a reason we have these emotions and we have these feelings and intuitions and unctions. It's spiritual. It relates to the spiritual realm. It relates to the heart, more so than just the mind. But these people are obsessed with the notion that their intellect can overcome all. That's why Mr. Spock, as a symbol, was put into the original Star Trek series, and people can argue that if they would like. But we see these same tropes over and over again throughout all of literature and throughout all of entertainment, and there's a reason for it. Anyway, let's get back to it. It says, in short, we needed a term that would designate simultaneously the masculine androgyny, its association with esoteric doctrines, secret fraternal societies, and with very ancient and very modern cosmological views, and with their presentation of a ladder of descent from heaven, a descent that implies the process of reverse engineering, and a reascent up the same ladder. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So, the inversion principle. You see, they view these things through the lens of a descent from heaven, and in order for them to ascend back to heaven, they have to turn these things in reverse. That's not how it works. That's not how God the Creator built this place. It doesn't work like that. They're trying to overturn the natural cycles of being in this place. We go through these natural cycles of time and these cycles of manifestation that God the Creator has instituted in this place, and they're trying to usurp that idea and reverse engineer creation in reverse order, of course, applying the inversion principle thereof to ascend, to take a shortcut there, essentially. And it's not going to work. Let's be honest. Let's read on, and we're going to close it up here in just a few minutes. Edward Carpenter, in his now classic early 20th century study of this whole problem, The Intermediate Sex, a study of some transitional types of men and women, cited a statement of Xavier Mayne, in which Mayne clearly intuited a deep connection between this alchemosexual masculine androgyny and the fraternal tradition of secret societies. Quote, I realized that I had always been a member of that hidden brotherhood and subsex, or supersex. In wonder, too, I informed myself of its deep instinctive Freemasonries, even to organized ones, in every social class, every land, and every civilization. End quote. What Mayne intuited only vaguely by his reference to its deep instinctive Freemasonries, our investigations, after encountering the imagery in The Grid of the Gods, soon revealed was a major component of an ancient esoteric tradition and a thinly veiled alchemosexual ritual in some fraternal societies. During the course of our mutual conversations and researches over the years on alchemy and related subjects, we came to another equally disconcerting realization. Alchemy was identical in almost all respects with the basic fundamentals of Christian sacramentalism. Both insisted that matter could be transformed into the vehicle for oneness with the divine. Both aimed, therefore, not only at this transformation of matter, but eventually at the apocalyptic transformation of mankind himself from base metal into immortal gold. Both insisted that a basic recipe be followed, employing the proper matter for this transformation, performed at certain specific times and according to certain specific formulae of words and the proper moral intentions. Where the two differed was that alchemy insisted that there was no need for special revelations, churches, or priesthoods to accomplish all of this. Rather, it was a goal pursued through the millennia by technological means. No church other than that of nature and nature's God were necessary. The one was a ritual of revelation, the other a ritual of technique and technology. And I'm going to pause for a moment there. And this is the juxtaposition in which we sit today. You see, when they're talking about alchemy, in this terminology here, they're speaking, of course, of this false alchemy that has come out from the real alchemy of the past, which was intrinsically linked to faith and religious circumstance. God's way. Nature's God. But now they've gone the other way, and they say that it's just a ritual technique and technology that is the important component here. Now, this disregards the spiritual side of all of it, and alchemy without spirituality is a dead entity, and that is certainly what they're trying to manufacture today with this false alchemy that they use today, and they call it modern science. It is scientism. It is the god of the new age, folks. Let's read on, and we're going to wrap it up. It is when one considers the full implications of these points that the disconcerting realization begins to dawn. For there is implicit in these propositions the idea that there is a hidden agenda concerning knowledge, power, technology, and the final transformation of man according to its own alchemosexual principles. Indeed, so disconcerting are the details of these principles and agendas that we do not, in this book, even come close to encompassing all the minutiae. The knowledge is too powerful and the danger too high. That said, we needed a term that could encompass the following things in addition to the two factors noted previously. And these were the primordial, metaphysical, spiritual, and even basic physics nature of the metaphor, both as it was applied to God or the gods, or to the primordial materia prima, and, for that matter, to primordial mankind. The persistent masculinity of the metaphor, as distinct from those readings of the esoteric and mythological tradition that emphasized the primordial femininity, an interpretation we find somewhat suspect for reasons argued in the main text. The association of the metaphor with esoteric traditions and fraternities, both in the sense of conventional secret societies and more broadly as subcultures. The association of the metaphor with immortality and the apocalyptic and hidden agenda of the alchemosexual transmutation of man, and finally, its obvious sexual implications. Thus, we have coined the term alchemosexuality to denote and encompass this entire constellation of concepts and their deep connections to esoteric and alchemical traditions, societies, rituals, and agendas. And that, folks, is at the heart of things going on in the world today. And Doctors Hart and Farrell coined the term alchemosexuality. It is this masculine androgynous factor involved in the unification of many of these broad ideas, the scope of science, this application towards transhumanism. It's why there's a transgender agenda in play in this world, and you could deny that all you want. There is most certainly an agenda pushing the idea. Not to say that people who didn't necessarily identify with the two accepted traditional sexes haven't existed in the past. They have existed in the past on a much lesser scale than they do today, because we've been socially engineered to accept some of these things societally. And now it's becoming a prevalent thing unto itself. And there's a reason for that. It's a precursor state for transhumanism. It's the shifting of the Overton window, folks. That's what it is. And it's described here as alchemosexuality, this androgyny, this masculine androgyny, this homogenization of everything, this diluting of variety in this world. There's a reason for that, and there's a cybernetics application to that. The less variety, the more easy is the control. Simple. That's what it's about. Not only that, if you have a bunch of people running around here that do not necessarily align with a traditional gender role, they're less likely to reproduce and have children that fulfills another agenda of the elites, population reduction, and we're seeing a massive effort of that underway right now. It's a eugenics-based idea. Eugenics is also a central tenet of transhumanism, and in fact, even pro-transhumanists have described transhumanism as, quote, eugenics without coercion, end quote. I kid you not. You can find that on a pro-transhumanist YouTube channel called Transhumania. They have a 5-hour-long documentary on there describing what transhumanism is, and in one of the sections, they describe transhumanism as eugenics without coercion, and these are the ones who are pro-transhumanist. They're not ambiguous about what their plans are. If you're familiar with eugenics, you know it's not on the up and up. Same can be said of transhumanism, folks. It is this perversion of the old alchemy. It's this false alchemy, as described by Doctors Hart and Farrell in this book. It's what's been promulgated today. It's what's been put forward by these dark occultists who run things, and it all has to do with this transhumanist agenda and notion, which is the fulfillment of their great work. They want to be the gods of this place in no uncertain terms, and they think in their hubris they can do it. But they are doomed to failure, for it will collapse catastrophically, much like the Tower of Babel. Anyway, folks, that's all the time that we do have for tonight, and we will continue this series at a later date. I appreciate each and every one of you. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and we will catch you next time. Have a good night now. Discover the amazing, clinically proven health benefits of original Tahitian noni. Original Tahitian noni includes powerful antioxidants, adaptogens, nutrients, and phytonutrients to naturally boost energy levels, immune system function, and overall health. Meticulously sourced from French Polynesia, this is the original superfruit, except no imitations. Original Tahitian noni. Visit ATR Health at alchemicaltechrevolution.com. and click on the Shop Here tab for more details.
But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.